Sarah smiled as she looked up at the train board. She saw her train, the 10:15, on platform 3. She whispered the details back to herself softly. 10:15, platform 3. She looked at her ticket again, just to be sure she was on the right train. She smiled, looking at the clock next to the board. 10 o'clock. 15 minutes, she spoke to herself. She was always very, very precise. She smiled as she turned. She thought, possibly will I have time. She saw a small coffee shop off to one side, almost empty. Good, she whispered to herself. I'll be able to get my first fix. She smiled, walking forward. This was a good day so far for her. It wasn't too hot or too cold. It was just right. Sun, not hot, just a few clouds in the sky. No rain, but a quiet Monday morning. She walked into the coffee shop, just 2 people ahead. As she walked in, something caught her eye. She wasn't too sure of what it was at first, but then she saw him. The man with the short brown hair, the glasses and the trench coat, reading a paper, as he sat there with his cappuccino in front of him, half drunk and looking like it had gone cold. She shook the thought away from her head. She stepped forward as the queue shortened. The woman asked her what she'd like. She smiled as she spoke. I'd like a latte, please, to go. She waited, turning to look at the man. There was still something odd about him, and she couldn't put her finger on it. The woman turned back to her and went, Here you go. That'll be £3.56, please. Sarah smiled as she paid, took the paper cup in her hand with a little plastic lid. She walked back out onto the concourse, pulling her little suitcase behind her. She had her ticket still in her hand, the one pulling the suitcase, as she walked, her heels softly clicking against the floor as she walked. She smiled, walking towards platform 3 as she showed the guard her ticket, taking a small sip of her latte as she did. He let her through, and as she was just about to turn onto the platform, she saw someone. The man in the trench coat with the paper. He was running. He was running across the platform towards the gate. She shook her head a little bit. He could be going for any train, she whispered, as she looked across the 5 platforms in front of her. There was 3 different trains in. He can't be possibly getting the same train as me, she thought. She looked up at the clock. 10:10. 5 minutes to go, she thought. Good. I'll be able to get a good seat, sit down and have a small drink before the train moves. She walked across the platform and onto the train. She found herself a window seat with a table in the middle, 2 chairs across from her. As she sat down softly, putting the suitcase beneath the table so she could touch it with her foot to make sure she knew where it was. She smiled as she settled in, knowing the journey was going to take a few hours. She took out her phone as she placed it in front of her, straightening it as she looked out the window. She saw the hustle and bustle of people running, walking along the platform. They were either running for this train or the other ones. As she smiled, she saw a young couple embracing, kissing each other, as one of them turned, walking towards their train. She smiled softly at the young couple. Young love, she whispered. She smiled, taking in the young girl, her brunette hair, the backpack on her back. As she smiled, She turned back, just looking down the aisle as she saw something. "Wait a second," she whispered. It was the man again, the man in the trench coat. She looked up at him and tilted her head softly. He took a seat a few seats away from her as he opened the paper again. That's when she realised there was something wrong about the paper. Definitely, she could see it now. The paper was over a week old. Why would a man be reading a paper a week old, especially taking his time to read it? That's when she realised who this man was. She looked over at him and smiled as the train started to pull away from the station. She looked over at the man and spoke softly. "So, is there anything good on TV tonight?" The man looked up at her, realising she was speaking, as he shook his head softly. "No, the TV's pretty boring, but there might be something interesting on the radio." He smiled as he closed the paper, folding it in half. He placed it down on the tray in front of him as he pulled his trench coat away, laying it on the chair as he walked towards her. He sat down across from her and smiled. She knew who this man was now. This was Sarah's first day on her new job. And right now, this man was about to give her the job. Sarah looked at the man as the train pulled further out of the station, starting to slowly pick up speed, moving through the countryside. She sipped her latte. She looked at the man. He looked her up and down and smiled. "So this is what they've given me to work with, is it?" He couldn't believe his eyes as he looked at her. She was young, yes, deceivingly young. She was in her early 20s, but did look a lot younger. She looked in her late teens, as she smiled at him and shook her head. "There's a lot to work with, but there's a lot I already know," she whispered. She smiled, shaking her head. Why was she whispering? There was no one on this train. Just him and her. "I was told I'd be receiving my first job off you," she smiled. He nodded softly as he took a packet out of his suit jacket, sliding it over to her. "This is your first job," he said to her. No smile this time. His eyes cold as he looked at her. She opened the packet slowly, her heart beating. She could hear it, hear her own heart as she opened that packet. She slid out a picture. It was a young man, couldn't be any more than 30, dressed in a suit as he was getting in the car. The picture had been taken from quite a distance. "You may do this job any way you choose," the man said, "but his death must be public." That's when she first realised it. It's when she realised she'd first made it. It's when she'd realised she'd become an assassin. I've been given exclusive access to Sarah's life. She's asked me to share these stories with you, to share these stories of her life. I don't know when they will come, but I'm proud to share these stories with you. And hopefully over the next few months, Sarah will grant me more access into her life, and will share these stories with you and with me. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you'll join me and Sarah very soon when she starts her very first adventure.